So yeah, anyone, if you have any questions, please leave in the comment box. So I see one diversity based on local foods across Africa has been used in, have been approximately compromised due to the impact of climate change. Well, that's more of a comment than a question. Um, uh, so let's move on to the next. I'm Egon from Chongqing University, China. I'm curious whether the rebound effect could hinder efforts to shift consumer behavior in dietary transformations. Specifically, if producers such as farmers continue maintaining high levels of meat production, might the resulting price decrease and drive up consumption? Could this effect be particularly significant in upper middle income and high income countries? I'm going to leave this to you, Bill. Did you see this question?
Yes, yes. No, it's a very important point. Producers consume what consumers buy, and consumers buy what producers consume. And so it is true that when production systems become lower cost, people do switch to that thing. But livestock systems have become lower cost in very interesting ways. So beef has not become cheaper. Dairy can become much cheaper, and poultry and eggs can become much lower cost. To some degree, also pork. Of course, those have the external cost as well as the financial cost that Astahan described now. But in terms of the rebound effect, that if consumers stop buying, then prices will fall and other consumers will buy. There's some truth to that, but the basic idea is producers only produce what consumers buy.
So it might have some effect, but the large picture is we should still do this, right? Eventually, they will be phased out. So how to, from University of Tokyo, a student asking how to deal with the trade-off between nutrition and environmental benefits of sustainable dietary choices. For example, protein alternatives may lack micronutrients to some extent. Anyone wants to take the question up?
I can start on that one, and if anyone wants to add on, they can. So many protein alternatives are actually very nutrient dense. You do see, in terms of beef, it's really high in iron and zinc. But if you think about fortification and enrichment programs, like in the United States, our enriched flour is fortified with iron, which helps with concerns in terms of iron deficiency anemia. But in general, a sustainable diet is one that doesn't just swap out plant proteins. It would also incorporate whole grains and fruits and vegetables. And when you have this diet that is balanced and includes multiple food groups, we have less of a concern about the differences in that we're missing from things like beef. But it's definitely possible to meet your micronutrient needs when you follow like a flexitarian or plant-focused diet.
I
Yes.
kind of wanted to add, thanks. May I?
Oh, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Melissa. I was just thinking about the other component of that question, so I'm glad that you took the second part of the question. So the first part was how about the trade-offs between nutrition and environmental benefits of sustainable dietary choices? So maybe I'm not an expert on that, like per se, but part of this report, I have read a lot of the literature, and one thing I could say that then the trade-off actually, at the global level at least, when we think about the planetary boundaries and the global hidden costs of our agri-food systems, mainly the environmental hidden costs being greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen emissions, land use change, and the hidden cost from our nutritious or unnutritious diets, the one that I mentioned before. The Food Systems Economic Commission, FSEC, report last year published different pathways of food systems transformation. And then they basically said, if you address the hidden costs from health hidden costs due to dietary change, you actually automatically address globally about 70% of the hidden costs from the environmental actions anyway, those categories I mentioned, like greenhouse gases, nitrogen, and land use change related hidden costs. So when you look at globally, they go hand in hand, but of course the trade-offs arise at local levels, also over different time periods. So those are the types of things that need like strong stakeholder consultation and commitment from also both businesses and governments to be able to address over time.
Bill, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm okay with it. Yeah.
Bill, do you
I think
want
the
to
other question
comment
about food-based
on-
dietary guidelines is interesting from in the chat box.
Oh, okay, from Peking University. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I know the food-based dietary guidelines, but the FBDGs of some countries are vague. I would like to ask Bill how to quantify the specific intake of each food type in these countries. Then do you think the FBDGs of each country can really guide the real consumption of the residents of those countries? If not, do there be any advice? Good
Yeah,
question.
very important question. What are called food-based dietary guidelines are just in contrast to nutrient by nutrient requirements. And when we say dietary guidelines, we just mean dietary guidelines that are communicated to individuals, and so it's always food-based. So I think eventually we'll stop using food-based and just say dietary guidelines because we're now many years into this change. Remember, nutrients were discovered in the early 20th century, and guidelines for nutrients were first quantified in the 1950s. And then these food group-based dietary guidelines were first published in the 1980s, became important in the 1990s, and widespread in the 2010s. So yes, many countries do not yet have their own national guidelines in a way that can be quantified, meaning that you could have the weight or the volume or the plate share or the number of calories by each of these food groups. So when we have a basket for the world as a whole, that's based on the 31 countries that have a quantifiable dietary guideline. In your own country, those of you who are in China, China does have a quantifiable dietary guideline, and many other countries do, and more will. The important point is they're all drawing on the same scientific consensus. So every country's dietary guideline is actually very similar in food groups. They're different in which items are the representative items, because in some countries you would write the guideline in terms of rice, in other countries in terms of tortillas, in other countries in terms of pounded yam, but it's always starchy staples nutritionally. And so similarly, vegetables, fruits, each of those, the items differ, but the food group is the same. And the quantities are pretty similar around the world because people are pretty similar around the world. And they're converging over time. So the scientific consensus is leading dietary guidelines to become more similar because people are drawing on the same literature, the same scientific literature. So yeah, yes, dietary guidelines are the scientific consensus that gives us an ability now to say what is a healthy diet. And those least cost items are the most sustainable. The least cost items within each food group are the lowest emitting. They're the lowest water using because they use the less land, the less energy. They are the most sustainable. So the question is, can we avoid the luxuries of life to have frugality, to have lower cost items that will be light on the pocket, light on your wallet, and also light on the planet?
Thank you, Bill. So I'd like to maybe we'll take two more questions, but before that, I'd like to comment on an early question about the concern of not eating enough, animal source protein. So that's why I put in the comment box this Zoe Nutrition Science podcast. I really highly recommend because I learned from them that the leading scientists on all those subjects that plants actually provide all the amino acids, all the important proteins that are from animals. So we can actually get a very healthy diets just from mostly plants. So again, yeah, that podcast, please go find it. There's one interesting question I also want to flag. And perhaps Melissa, you can address it. So while basically the question asking meat is deeply embedded in our culture, in many cultures. So, what strategies are most effective for encouraging large-scale diets, dietary shift away from meat? What's your experience, Melissa?
That's a really great question. And so I think, if you look at the diets that, sustainable diet patterns, most of them don't call for people becoming vegan, right? We're not asking people to give up animal protein entirely. We're asking people to reduce their portion sizes and make plant proteins or more sustainable animal proteins like dairy, more of the cornerstone of their diets. And so thinking about having meat be more of something that is for like traditional celebrations or holidays, or thinking about meat as something that's, when you're thinking about traditions and culture, keeping meat as a part of those special days, but trying to think about strategies where we can reduce the portion sizes on a day-to-day basis. And it might be unreasonable to expect someone to give up meat altogether, but if we can start with maybe in thinking about some of the stir fries and other recipes, you don't have to take meat totally out, but having part meat, part plant-based proteins, and it, like I said before, it takes a long period of time to change people's dietary patterns. And so we need to think of these kind of intermediate steps that we can help people come to, that maybe in the long term we can get to some of these goals, but in the short term we need to think of ways that we can equip people to make these small changes that over time and across populations do add up to large health and climate benefits.
Yeah. And one lesson I learned is that don't try to school your mother-in-law after she spent hours preparing a table of meat about the sustainability of agri-food systems. That won't go well. Okay, let's take one more question. Then we're way over time, but so how to address inequalities in food consumption and related environmental impact across income groups. If we improve the diets of the poor, the total environmental impact will be even greater, but it doesn't seem reasonable to reduce the consumption of the rich or let the rich eat less meat. Are there any other ideas other than dietary adjustments? Bill, you want to take it?
Yeah, I can try,
yeah,
and then maybe, because
yeah.
I forgot to mention actually part of the report, because this is a very big deal for us, right? As the United Nations, most of our member states are very, on the lower end of the income distribution as well as welfare distribution, but also they're bearing the brunt of climate change related disasters. And of course, our member states would always ask this question. So, we didn't cause all these issues. Why should we eat less meat or, use less fossil fuels or whatever, those kinds of approaches that come to mind. But of course, when you talk about structural transformation of economies, right, there's a natural progression of wealth, welfare, dietary transition, as well as like environmental relationships that change over time as you become more productive, you're more urbanized. There's this whole pathways to transition. So when we look at the historical structural transformation relationships as well, we document actually some of those pathways that are things that we want to leapfrog. Like I've mentioned, the increase in sugar sweetened beverages or salt consumption and worsening of environmental effects like Kuznets curves. People will be familiar with it. As the economies get better, these things get worse and then tend to get better over time. So those things help us identify, things that we need to leapfrog. How we can do that is basically, again, through international collaboration, especially including social safety nets to make sure that the most vulnerable populations in most vulnerable countries are covered by some sort of social safety net, and that is increasingly nutrition sensitive. You don't just provide starches and cheap calories, but you provide better balanced diets from early on, including, of course, the improvements in food environments and food education and nutritional training. And there's no either or question, right? So you have to do that anyway as part of a rural transformation in these countries. And when you do it in a systemic level, hopefully you will be able to prevent that worsening of the both environmental and social and health hidden costs over the structural transformation period. But yeah, it's very difficult. Well,
yeah, I think Lynn's question from Northwest University is really important. Can low-income people gain the diet quality that rich and high-income people have enjoyed without burning the planet? And the answer comes down to intensification, to using the smaller areas of land and using animals for animal source foods, which are to some degree needed, more intensely, more inputs, so that each small location can feed the whole nation. So how do you do that? You do that with inputs that are tailored to the needs of that animal, and this idea of sustainable intensification, where smaller locations get a lot of inputs and become very productive. So the most important case is dairy for milk, but also for yogurts and cheeses and dairy products. If you have one cow who is milked 3 times a day, who is fed with soybeans and corn from very high productivity, small acreage, very little acreage, can make a lot of corn and soybeans, and then you have one cow milked 3 times a day, you have very low impact milk. But if you have one cow who is grazing over lots of area, who is eating from a large land area, and is living a long life, milked only twice a day, then there's a lot of methane per unit of milk, and then you cook the planet with the dairy that you need. The same is true for fish. The same is true for many, many other, essentially all other foods. Sustainable intensification is the only path to dietary improvement without cooking the planet. Otherwise, you just have to expand area and use more and more land conversion, more and more animals with their methane production as well as their carbon emissions per unit of food. So to have more food with more sustainably, we need that low cost, very intensive production on the small area that can then feed many people elsewhere.
That's great. I think our last 2 speakers ended on a very positive note that we can do this. And on that note, I would like to conclude our webinar today. And thank you so much for sticking around over time. I would definitely reach back, and I want to talk more about your research and potential collaboration opportunities.
Very good.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Melissa.
thank you, everyone.